Forced Jenner. Yeah. I didn't watch it, but yeah. That was great. That's great. You know, I'm for that. I'm very bored.
Thank you guys all for coming. Just a quick reminder that we do record programs, so don't worry, your faces are not in it, maybe the backs of your head. So if you have any issues with the back of your head in the recording, let me know. But we do like to put these on our YouTube page so people can have the opportunity, if they couldn't make it in person, to view it. So welcome, Janet. Okay. May I introduce Janet, who is Janet Michelson, our board member, who is in charge of events and programming on behalf of the board.
Good. So yeah, I'm very happy to welcome back Jim Zervanos, who was one of our most stimulating speakers last year. Last year we had all authors. This year we have a combination of authors and all different types of lecturers, and last year spoke about his amazing book, That Time I Got Cancer, a love story, and it was very personal and it was very moving, and we had people at the end who hung around to ask questions, and I'm hoping that people will hang around and ask questions today. This is a totally different type of book. Jim's 3 books are on the back table. Love Park, which was his first, Philadelphia, Greek American Story, and his second, That Time I Got Cancer. This is my own copy of it from last year. And then this year, we have the book that tells the story of Jim's year of teaching high school. And so I'm going to leave it to him.
Thank you so much for coming. It is great to be back here. It was only a year ago, and I got lucky. I got 2 books kind of back to back, and it's a thrill to be here. And especially a thrill to be sharing with you a very different kind of story, in contrast to That Time I Got Cancer. In a weird way, it almost feels kind of like a sequel, because I was nothing but a fiction writer before, well, I got sick, and then the story kind of came to me, and I couldn't resist telling that story, as a memoir. And so a few years passed after that, and I felt really comfortable writing nonfiction, but I really didn't know if I was going to write another memoir. What struck me was that we were living in this rather turbulent time, and I had been teaching high school for more than 25 years. And I've always been impressed by my teenage students. I teach all seniors in a suburban school district around here, much like the one we live in. And in combination with just having always thought so fondly of my 17, 18-year-old kids, and impressed by how they transition out into the real world. Most impressed by the stories that they write for me in class. I teach an AP Modern Literature class and a creative writing class. And it's just a great thrill. But the year was right. It struck me that in 2016, 2017, with all of these big ideas that were swirling around in the air, that it was due time that I write about, this place that was this high school that I had been teaching at. And so that was the inspiration for it. I wanted to write not just about my life as a teacher, but mostly, about these kids and how they were responding to all of these incredible forces that were swirling around in the air. It was the year of the election. The Me Too movement had just exploded. There were a number of especially horrible school shootings. And I didn't know what form this book would take. And so I just sort of had the idea, in part because I knew it was going to be an especially busy year, to keep a diary. In part because the reason why it was going to be especially busy, because my wife, who's in the back row, was starting a doctoral program while working full time. And it was more than payback time for me, because when I was 6, she more than took on the load of having the kids and taking care of me. And so I was more than happy to say, I want you to focus completely on, your work and your program, and, I got this. I didn't want her to even think of like, your job is the laundry and I got everything else. No. So that was going to be part of what put the pressure on me to somehow write during this busy year. And that ended up becoming part of the story. I mean, I couldn't resist seeing the connection between the Me Too movement, all sorts of interesting, with gender and identity politics and expectations for even just the roles of the male versus the female in the home. It all just sort of seemed to click thematically. So I was going to keep a diary, and I thought maybe this will turn into a novel, but I knew I would get at least material. A couple of weeks passed before I realized maybe what was inevitable, that my life at home raising, at the time, 7- and 3-year-old boys, I was seeing these parallels between not just the themes that they were, that I saw them connecting with, not that they were conscious of it, but as a dad recognizing, there's not a whole lot of difference. I appreciated how my life as a father was contributing to my life as a teacher, and vice versa. How I was a better father, hopefully, because of my experience as a teacher. And so, rather than limit my journaling to the day in the life at school, I started incorporating anything that sort of struck me as interesting and connected with being a dad, themes that I saw even these little guys dealing with at home. And I wasn't getting up in the morning and typing at the laptop or finding time to, do my routine the way I used to do. This was on the phone dictating journal entries. This was, finding some time during lunch at school when something would happen. It was that kind of spontaneity. But before long, I started to realize, I kind of like this form, and maybe this is the thing. And so I became a bit more intentional about crafting these daily entries. And before the year ended, I think I made it a point to really go after books that were diaries. And lo and behold, innumerable people had beat me to it. There are an incredible number of terrific books. That was a great surprise to me, that were in the form of diary. And a lot of them took sort of creative approaches. And I ended up doing just that. But we can talk about that more later. I wanted to mention before I go on that this is my 3rd book. I hadn't anticipated writing any nonfiction, and here we are, a second memoir. My first book was a novel, and the reason why it's free is because when I was sick with cancer and I fantasized about maybe one day, God willing, I survived, writing another book, and maybe I would one day write about that experience that I was having. But the other part of the story is that that all happened to me about a year after that first book came out. And things were going really well. So well that this small press out in Wisconsin who printed that first book decided, you know what, let's print another 2,000 copies. And no sooner did she do that I was out of commission. And so there are a lot of books in my basement. And I said, if I get back out there again at any event like this, I will only give them away. So don't walk out of here without one of those, or else the old expression of he can't give them away will actually be true. So, if you see that I'm still here and there are 5 or 6 left there, just hide and take 5. And then the other 2 books are available too. I'm happy to report too, I just found out very recently that I have a novel coming out next November 25. And I'm really excited about it because it's something that has its roots going back a couple of decades, and I've revised it, and as life has gone on, and I've had new experience. The book has become something that's really near and dear to my heart and feels really current to me. So I'm really excited to share that. Hopefully I'll be back next year, next November 25. And
Great.
This book is dedicated to my students. And then these 3 people, Mary Ellen Goldfarb, Andy Weinman, and Dan Luce, who showed me the way to be a teacher. And I just want to tell you about them real quick, because it tells my story of how I became a teacher. It's a complicated story, and it won't make any sense because it's just filled with loopholes, but I'll say this. I was an English and art major at Bucknell, And like so many English and art majors, I ended up going off to law school because, you know, you got to make a living. So I went to law school and I was 3 semesters into Temple Law School when the phone rang when I was studying for a tax final. This is the part where there are a lot of loopholes and inevitable questions. But on the other end of the line was a woman calling from Pencrest High School, where I have now been teaching for 29 years. And she said, you know, there's an opening here, a woman's going to maternity leave. It was winter, right? So my 3rd semester law school. Spring semester, would you be interested? And I said, you have no idea. I'm sitting here studying for a tax fund. What's worse, and here the story always gets longer. I had done everything as kind of a backup plan to get certified to teach. And then in the 11th hour, I decided I'm just gonna do things for a backup plan. Just, you know, get after what you want to do in life. And so I was small school. And I told her this. I said, unfortunately, I'm unqualified. And I'm also studying for my tax final, and I should finish this semester at Temple. And she said, I don't want to be the one to ruin your life. Finish your law degree. If you're still interested, as I had obviously expressed to her, call me back in a year and a half. Well, I called her back in about a week and a half. I said, I finished my exams. I know I told you I'm not certified because I never did my student teaching. That's the one thing that I hadn't done, pretty big thing. And I said, but can I come and meet you? And this was Mary Ellen Goldfarb who had made that phone call. And I went down to Pencrest High School and we met in the library and we just kind of hit it off, understanding all the while, like, don't know why we're having this conversation. But here we are. And we hit it off well enough. And I made it clear to her that I really want to do this. That she talked to a couple people and I talked to a couple people and we were going to make this happen. And I needed to do my student teaching. So I didn't take that job. That was an impossibility. But we created a scenario where I would do my student teaching that semester. She had to go to this guy, Dan Luce, who this book is also dedicated to. He was the principal at the time. And he said, Mary Ellen, we said we weren't going to take any more student teachers. The last few have been a disaster. And she said, Dan, he went to Bucknell. He's a baseball player. And his favorite author is John Updike, my favorite author, time anyway, from Reading, Pennsylvania, which was a match with Dan. And he said, okay. To this day, Dan and I are dear friends. He's a tremendous reader. He's read everything that I've written. And it's an honor to dedicate the book to him. Andy Weinman, the 3rd guy on here, was also crucial. I think without any of these 3 people, I don't know that I would have committed to the job. Andy ended up being my mentor. And Mary Ellen knew what she was doing when she said, I'm assigning you to this guy, Andy. He was a terrific teacher, and I student taught under his tutelage. He taught this, he was an English teacher, obviously, but he taught this art history class that reminded me of an art history class that I took at Bucknell. And when I watched Dan Luce teach, he was a principal, but he also taught the AP Modern Lit class. When I watched these guys teach, I couldn't believe it. These were not my teachers in high school. It felt really high level. I mean, they were teaching, I thought, if I can do what these guys are doing, oh, I have scored. And so I got hired for that fall, and not for one second have I looked back and questioned that choice. So here we are. So all that passion and interest, you know, goes into the writing of this book. The last thing I did, literally, everything was polished to a T. This is back and forth with the editor at this company, the publisher. And she's like, I still think you just don't need the dates. There were all these journal entries, and they were the last remnants of the original idea. And it just made no sense to me. Remove the dates, but I did. And so when you pick up a copy of this book, you'll see like diary, where are the dates? You know, she was right. You know, and so needless to say, these are not in chronological order, but she was right to remove those dates so that it wasn't distracting, that it just sort of creates this spirit of, you know, day in life, one after another, and so on. So I'm going to read the first 2 chapters. The first one's rather short, the next one's a few pages. And then I'm going to pause, and then I thought we could do sort of Q&A. And we'll see how that goes, and we'll just chat. And then, time permitting, I'll kind of circle back, and I have another short chapter to end on. So this first chapter is called Ryan's Lament. Marco Rubio. Remember that? On Zoom. Or, Brian Clement. Ryan Henry comes to see me at the end of the day. He practically tiptoes into the classroom to be sure he's not bothering me, checking to see if the coast is clear before making eye contact. How do you make a point you're trying to make? His gaze shifts about as if he's casing the place and we're about to make some kind of secret deal. A junior already, he's grown tall since his mysterious month-long hospitalization last spring. Now he's skinny, continuing developments that make it more difficult for him to disguise the discomfort I know he feels with personal interactions like this. Well, we lock eyes. He crosses his arms, hovers just beyond my depth. So, how do you make a point? He goes on, I'm working on tone. He's entirely earnest. I've been reading Joyce. You know, there's like an Irish early 20th century tone. I assume he's into a portrait of the artist as a young man. I'd like to write in that tone, he says. Me too, I think. He says, it's so funny, so great. I agree. Don't worry about tone. Let your tone grow out of the story you have to tell. You've got your own voice, your own tone. Remember that story you wrote in 9th grade? The last time he was my student, technically. Since then, he's paid me the occasional visit, like this one, shot me the occasional email, attaching some cryptic draft for me to read. I say, it was funny, warm, but also biting, with a real edge, but not cynical, a real tenderness, I remember. Between the teenage son and the parents, he's abroad, right? They visit, he's going through something, but he's really happy to see them. Ryan nods, absorbed in thought, seemingly mesmerized by my description, perhaps impressed by my memory of his story. But there's something else he's trying to wrap his mind around. I don't want to be too cynical, he says. I feel like I'm too cynical. My stuff lately, I mean. You said it was warm and tender. I wish I could still write like that, like I did then. I take in this heartbreaking insight and feel a pang of regret for the fact of the insight and for having led him to it. You can still write like that, I tell him, and I want to believe this is true. I can read his pained expression. I wish I could be that way again. I offer an understanding smile. I want him to be happy with who he is becoming. I remember my own son, 7-year-old Christopher, not long ago, crying on his bed after I scolded him too harshly, I thought, until he said, I used to be good, but now I'm bad. Time stopped, or I wanted it to stop, as he heaved miserably, and I implored him to believe me. You're good, you're good. I asked Ryan what he's reading now. Saul Bellow. He's a lot like Philip Roth. You told me about Roth. I just finished The Plot Against America. I nod. What the hell was I thinking? He's just a kid. Now I'm into The Adventures of Augie March, he says. I like it. It's great, I agree. And we leave it at that. There's no turning back, I think, as he exits. A moment later, he reappears in the doorway. I just sent you a new story. Can't wait to read it, I say. Immediately, I check my email and see an attachment entitled, Somebody Please Help Edwin. When I look up again, he's gone. So that's that chapter. The next one is called The Zeitgeist. Today it begins. The motor starts. On the first day with students in the first class. I've presented the syllabus, given an overview of modern literature, talked about the big themes, moral ambiguity, anxiety, confusion, that mark the modern age we still live in. While the students are filling out a personal information sheet that includes a list of books they've read over the summer, 2 boys are talking about Jude the Obscure, required reading for this course, AP Literature and Composition, AKA Modern Lit. One kid says he found the ideas clear enough, the language dated and difficult, but he liked it overall. I'm hovering nearby. I dare to chime in. Thomas Hardy's a great place to start our conversation about modern lit, even though it's dated, as you say. Hearing myself, I hope that he doesn't think I'm a complete dork, or at least that my dorkiness is matched by his. The kid grins, because it's obscure. That's it. There's the spark. The engine revs, I'm fired up to see what these kids have in store, to see what this kid has. In the minutes before the bell, we read the opening of F. Scott Fitzgerald's essay, The Crack-Up, in which he asserts, the sign of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposite ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. For homework, they'll reread this introduction and write about what they think it all means, what Fitzgerald was going through, what was on his mind when he cracked up at age 39. This question will segue into a class discussion of the zeitgeist, whose meaning I'll ask them to figure out by the root words. This line of reasoning has become predictable. One kid who knows some German will announce that Zeit means time. As for Geist, I'll egg them on toward the one word they're all thinking of, poltergeist. Skeptically, a few will guess ghost. Not ghost exactly, I'll say, but spirit. Spirit of the times, that's it. Zeitgeist means the spirit of the times. That's what we're talking about here. Then it's back to the Fitzgerald quote. I'll ask them what opposed ideas are battling out in their minds these days. I'm always thrilled and unnerved by what they have to say. We apply to colleges that we know we probably won't get into. We vote even though we know even though we know it won't really make much of a difference in the way things are. We come to school every day, even though we know there's a chance we could get shot. Most of these kids are experts in retaining the ability to function, despite these mind-twisting contradictions. They are also experts in disguising their anxiety, as I imagine Fitzgerald was before he cracked up a decade short of 49, the age he was sure he'd be all right. At lunch, I tell my teacher friend, Dean Garrett, how I feel already charged up by my AP students, many of whom Dean shares in AP government. As usual, I don't know anyone's names since I teach only seniors whom I've just met, whereas Dean teaches most of them as juniors in AP US history. I tell Dean how impressed I was by the boy who observed that Jude was obscure. When I describe his hip, thick-rimmed glasses, orange mattress shirt, and khaki cargo shorts, Dean smiles and informs me that Miles is the real deal. Surprised I don't know him already, somehow. Apparently, Miles' reputation precedes him. He's applying to Harvard early decision, Dean says, and will probably get in. The gauntlet has been thrown down. Alone at my desk after school, I think of Fitzgerald before he cracked up at 39, still believing he had a good 10 years left to fulfill his dreams, which he later realized had already eluded him. What defeated him exactly? What two opposed ideas was he no longer able to hold in the mind at the same time? He writes of hope colliding with pessimism, of the world facing conditions once considered impossible, of his own dreams revealing themselves to be embarrassingly unimportant. As I approach 49, I see that for a decade or more, I too have been balancing in my mind with increasing effort two opposed ideas. My gratitude for my general satisfaction in life, and an anxious recognition that my own dreams have eluded me, or at least my youth has. These days, that old driving desire to achieve, perhaps once fueled by vanity and blind confidence, has been met with an unfamiliar desire that I recognize as peculiarly unselfish and not entirely unwelcome. It is a desire that competes with the artistic impulses, or that at least demands shared space with them. It is a mysterious growing desire not to be inspired as a writer and artist, an identity I'm loath to relinquish, but to inspire as a teacher and father, to be an optimistic encourager of dreams, a shameless promoter of romantic ambitions, a sage guide for my students and sons as we confront the impossible. While I've been sitting here, my mind is open to crack to make room for something I deliberately neglected all summer, my own writing. I had trusted an unprecedented compulsion to free myself from the Byzantine trials of stringing words together in hopes that I might clean the plate for something unexpected. I believe this plan has paid off because it has helped me to realize that it's my life as a teacher I want to write about. Now, after 21 years, through the eyes of a father of two young boys, during this unfathomable time in America, where a dream deferred seems at risk of becoming a dream destroyed before it can ever become a dream fulfilled, where women are still rising up and facing down the bullish, boorish tyranny of men, and where the pen is no longer necessarily mightier than the sword, if it ever was, let alone the gun, the semi-automatic rifle to be precise. And yet it's hope that compels me. Hope in the ideals of America as I see them embodied in these great, smart, creative, and passionate and compassionate kids. I've decided to keep a diary of the sort I might ask my creative writing students, of each day's memorable details, recorded faithfully somehow, if not typed on my laptop or in my notes app after the last bell, then dictated into my iPhone while driving to pick up Michael from preschool, or in the parking lot after getting the groceries, or at the curb outside the elementary school before going inside to get Christopher, or at home after I put the boys to bed, lying next to Vanna, who's exhausted after a full day's work, even before she started her full night's work, required for her intensive 2-year doctoral program, sitting up in bed, reading another chapter, or cranking out a paper due by midnight. After watering the plants and tidying up my classroom, I slip out of school at 2:30, 20 minutes before the contract day is over, understanding that the tidal wave of student work I'll have to read will begin to build tomorrow, after which it will crash and ebb and swell in relentless cycles until June. I'll pause there. So I could take questions if there are any. So I'll pause here just to mention why I want to pause here, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, the book ends up sort of taking this different direction. Proportionally, I guess it's about a third of the book at most, maybe, that veers off and touches on home life and life as a dad and the 2 boys. But those first 2 chapters, you know, I wanted to lead with those 2, just to sort of set the tone. All that. So, good questions. Either about what we just read, or even about the writing process. Anything.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much for that. I'm so happy that to listen to the
Thank you.
reading. That's really great.
Thank
And then meditation was provided zeitgeist part. And then that was very interesting listening about that. And then, but listening, wonder how the current ongoing zeitgeist is based on COVID-19 pandemic. Did you think about that? Maybe probably during the writing, and then that's called meditation. That's can be something which can be doing.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the year that was the original material preceded COVID by a couple years. You know, and when it was going on, I thought, for better or for worse, you know, how might I incorporate this? Needless to say, writing about this that year would have been a drag and not all that interesting in the way that this book is written. Anecdotally, like, you know, that's the whole, there's not a lot going on socially, and, you know, it's just kind of a big nothing. That said, certainly in the aftermath, you know, it's been a slow climb back to normal. And now the hard thing is to sort of parse out, is this still you know, sort of echoes or remnants of COVID? Or is this just something that was already a trend that was going on, maybe related to this thing, the phone, you know, and just lifestyle differences? And of course, those 2 things swirled together. You know, any parent who had a child during that time that was especially in that transition age, where they might be just getting their phone, or they're experiencing loneliness and need to connect with that outside world, you know, the social media or communication was a welcome blessing. But you know, it created a few bad habits and addictions to those screens too. There's no denying it. So now I think there's a whole lot of kind of undoing that we need to do, if it's possible. Jonathan Haidt, the guy that wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, just came out with a new book called The Anxious Generation, and a long subtitle. Coincidentally, I considered calling my book Anxious Days with Generation Z. But my wife mostly, and I think rightly, noted that's catchy, but your book's about so much more than anxiety. And the new Jonathan Haidt book is exactly and only about that and the causes of all of that. But he has very specific and prescriptive advice for the whole country, if not the planet, for how to you know, wean kids off of their addiction to phones and social media. And I am 100% for it. And I couldn't be more proud of Lower Merion, and I hope, as they often are, that they end up being trendsetters, because this year I think is the first year, right? That K to 12, no phones in school from the first bell to the last. And as my son will rightly tell me, you know, I'm fine. And I'm not, this is not causing me damage. And I think he's probably right. The flip side of that, though, is what you're not doing when you're doing this. And that's hard to persuade somebody of. Oh, can we roll the film? This is this random video, and I was looking through files and thinking, what can I show to go into the point? And as a teacher who knows the contrast, let me just set this up now by saying, like, discipline in the old-fashioned way isn't an issue anymore. You know, or even the pleasure. I'm nostalgic about it. Like, kids, you know, settle down, let's get started now. Never again. Not as long as these things are there. Now it's like, hello, because 30 kids could be in the room. Childhood friends, they've been going to school forever together. And if they've got that thing, you know, homeroom is quiet for 10 straight minutes. These guys, they're all doing beginning of class, everybody rolls in. 9 out of 10 kids are just doing this before the bell starts. So if you take that away, they're going to say to each other and talk. Simple. So this is from 2001, my high school, Pencrest. Random videos, montage. Whoops. Oh, it went to the next video. Now, the main thing that you might not think about, if you don't really think about these things, but again, it's not the negative things that come from the phones, it's just what you're doing when there's not a phone in your hand. And usually a phone is in the kids' hands now. They're waving at the camera. You know, they probably have to be like that, or at least it would be like that. And they're like clapping with 2 hands together because there's not a other thing in their hand, you know? It's amazing. And I look at that and I just think of one word, happy. They just look happy. And I don't see that. I don't see that anymore. So I don't think it's lost in the human condition. I just think that we need to kind of press restart. Right. Yeah, so that's that. That in the ballpark of an answer. You know, you were talking about the continuing zeitgeist, COVID, the phones, and all this stuff.
I don't know if it's a question or I teach community college and class. I'm doing a unit on concentration and focus and reading studies, and it's no surprise this is the thing, right? If a student has their phone off and down on their desk, it affects the cognition of everyone around them, not just that student. So most of my colleagues have given up the battle. I've not. I'll quit before they're just incredibly damaging. And like you, I used to come into class and have to settle everybody down. They're making friends. They're talking about assignments. Now it's just like everyone's in that bubble. Horrifying.
Yeah, I was kind of soft and trying to kind of transition and allow these sort of in-between things. And my first semester this year, luck of the draw just happened to be the students I got first semester. I get all new students second semester, all semester. It just so happened that this past first semester was really difficult because I had a certain percentage of students that was way too many that it was just a headache beyond. And I kind of had to press restart. And I did something I've never done. I printed out a sheet of rules. Like, it's so against everything in the way that I want to be a teacher. But, you know, circumstances demand, you know, change of approach sometimes. And everybody on the first day of the second semester got a handout. I tried to make it as playful as possible, but it was very clear about no AirPods, no phones, no way, no how, no hoodies. I need to see your ears. I need to, you know, because the AirPod in there, right there, sit so that it's here and the teacher's there. And it's incredible. But that's what happens when something just goes unchecked and it's natural. Like I can listen to this guy and kind of have my music on or whatever, you know. And again, it's not a bad thing, and maybe they can pull it off and get straight A's doing that, but without any sense of like what you're missing and just how that's not okay. And you know, rule number one is I teach like it's just you and I in the room, and I want you to think of it as that, and that starts with put those distractions away.
Great passages. Thank you for that reading. So we may have just answered this as a collective, but I'm curious to know from your perspective, with your students, your children, even maybe, what do you see as the greatest challenge young people are facing?
Well, they might not recognize it as a challenge, but what we just talked about for sure is what I recognize as the biggest difference. And it's just upsetting to me because regarding them, you don't know what you don't know. They don't know what they're missing, how things used to be, and how I believe just by simply removing this thing, at least during the school day, that they're going to re-engage and experience that kind of dynamism. Understandably, you know, kids suffer and there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of things that parents protect kids from. But I think there's been a softening that's gone too far. With all due respect to administrations that I have taught, you know, through, when you teach for 30 years, you probably, average teacher probably has been through 5 principals, you know, and so much is determined by the top person. And I assume that in Lower Merion, that call to do away with phones was the top guy. You know, the superintendent made that call. That's a tough call, but that's kind of all it takes. And there are other things, all the things you read in the New York Times, the headlines, you know, like school attendance is all this stuff. It's true, it is. School attendance, there is a feeling sometimes, and you know, this where I teach is much like where we live here, and I'm sure it's not. Well, we know it's not. You know, the kind of absenteeism and truism that I don't know the data, but I've heard anecdotally, like it's astonishing in the city, in the Philadelphia School District, like 10 truancy officers, and I forget the numbers, but I knew the percentage, and then we did the math, the number of students that were there. It's like, it's such an incredible impossibility to manage that. You know, in my more pleasant circumstances, you know, kids out 10, 12, 15, 20 days, a marking period. And there's no rule, you know. Back when I first started, it was 10 days you're absent, and it's an administrative failure. And I don't know what went on behind the closed doors. If every person who like, ah, sorry, you hit 10, like, that's again, the administration, they can make their exceptions and decide, you know, it's not right for this kid. But the fact that the rule was there, I think was effective in bringing kids to school. And sooner or later, they figure out, like, they're not going to do anything. A kid might show up. And as long as they're passing the class, and some kids just want to pass the class. So we're not talking, I'm not talking about the high flyers, you know, the Jude the obscure kid who's going to go up to Harvard next year. Sure, don't want to miss a day. But for the ones that, and I guess that gets back to the COVID question, and my feeling about that too is that, and we all read about it when it was going on, that the really excellent students who are bookish or do well to be independent and really can immerse themselves in and self-discipline and do the readings, etc., not only got through it, but thrived and maybe even did better than they would have under normal circumstances. Which isn't to say, let's do that more often. I mean, that's just that. At the other end of the spectrum, though, the kids where it didn't work for them was a catastrophe. Yeah, I think they really lost time. There was a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of kids who had a really hard time getting through that and readjusting and coming back. So it feels to me like we're closer to the old normal than that, but it was a lot of pain. A lot.
Two points. One is the phone thing. I teach health. I mean, it's not my primary job, but I teach it once a month, a double period in high school. I've been doing it for 24 years. And as you walk into the school, they have like those little shoe bags, you know, the ones that have little pockets, and each pocket has a cell phone in it. It's a girls' school, so each pocket has a girl's name. That is where your phone goes. And a happier group of girls you will not see. You'll see things very much like what you showed in your video from 2001. Yeah, I forget. The pandemic and the isolation was amazing from my point of view as a pediatrician, particularly the summer of 21, when most people had been through an entire year of online or hybrid education, tremendous suffering, tremendous isolation, and a lot of anxiety and depression. I remember one day out in my Malvern office, I made 6 mental health referrals in a day. By the end of the day, I felt like I needed to be carried out. One person liked being on the Zoom, and all of the people that I asked, and it was the 7th grade group. And you can imagine why. She said, because nobody looks at me. And when you think of the psyche of 7th grade girls, everyone is sizing you up, everybody's checking your weight, everyone is looking at your hair. You know, you can make this part of you look nice.
Well, that's a great point, you know, and so she experienced that relief for a time, and then you got to go back, right? And it's worse than it ever would have been in the first place, because she missed that period of time where she.
What was the mitigating factor? If people could get out and they could play soccer, or they could play tennis, or they could do something together with a group of people, those kids were better.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no substitute for the actual experience to learn those skills or how to deal with some uncomfortable social situation.
Talk to us about, you started 29 years ago. Where in your going through the training of lockdown, how far into teaching were you when the thought of violence really in entering schools was becoming conversation? And today, to them, is it just another normal drill? I had tornado drills growing up, because I was in the Midwest, and we loved, oh, I really get, you know, get in the hall. It was nothing to us. Are they feeling that way? It'll never happen. Let's just go locked down. Or do you just talk about your career?
During this period, that 14, 15, 16, I mean, the Marjorie's going to Florida. Yep. End up in this book. And there are more than one in the spring of that year. And that was when, you know, the kids were going to rallies. Kids in my high school, they were getting on buses and going to Washington. So it's very much a part of all of our minds. The teachers are going into the auditoriums, and local FBI people are coming and giving us, you know, instructions, watching videos, actually going back to our rooms and being instructed, like, make sure, what's your plan if this happens, you know, this kind of thing. When going into lockdown mode, those doors are shutting and getting all sorts of new strategies for, you know, it really felt unnerving. We're still doing the drills, knock on wood. I guess since COVID, there haven't been, and I apologize if I'm forgetting, there have been some, but not in the dozens, you know, these that are just so alarming like that. But obviously that doesn't matter. But it doesn't feel quite as upsetting.
Here to,
well, we're numb to the exercises. We do that like a fire drill, you know. But I will say that there have been a time or two, and it's only at 1,000, 1,000, where we're waiting for the principal to say, this is just a drill. Because when that thing comes on and he hasn't told us ahead of time, and he'll tell us later, like the police tell us we have to do that every now and then. It sounds so terrible, but we got to see what it's like when we don't shoot you an email. A lot of times we'll even get an email in the morning, like there's going to be a fire drill 7th period today. So we get into it and 5 seconds pass before the principal gets on and says, this is a drill. As opposed to there's an active shooter in the building. But it is an instant cold sweat and unnerving. But we know the deal. And you get away from the door and we all go into the corner and sit there quietly. Phones go into, off mode. And the kids get it, You don't want to be the guy whose phone rings in the middle of a situation. Yeah.
You were teaching during when 9/11 happened.
Oh, yeah.
I taught at Upper Darby High School. I taught refugee students there, and 9/11 was on in another classroom on the TV, and teachers came running in and said, "You got to turn the TV on." And it was pretty brutal. I mean,
Sure was.
Kids were coming from Africa to Upper Darby as refugee students, and nothing happened in America. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about an image that's in stark contrast to everything we've been talking about. I remember the TV, the big box, hanging the big steel thing in the front of the room, and we got the buzz in the hallway, turn on the TV, and I remember standing there with Emily Osgood, senior girl, and we're looking up at those images and we're gasped. Two of us standing. It's also, and I do an essay with my AP kids, where the guy who wrote Generation X, actually, Douglas Copeland, wrote this nice essay where he talks about the zeitgeist and that pivot point with that 9/11 is the last major world event that's not recorded on smartphones. That thing looks more like the JFK assassination than any event that has happened since. And I find that fascinating. Just these couple of angles that we all have seen, the half a dozen or something that play. But a couple years later, bless you, everybody, we would have a whole different experience of what that day was. For better or for worse. Yes, please.
Since we're talking about how are you guys doing AI generating?
That's one of my new rules. At least I can point to it and say, I said, as if we need to. But yeah, I mean, the way I treat it is no way, no how. And, there's no use for it. We're reading, we're writing critically, it's a creative writing class. One student last semester, again, not one of my high flyers, but they probably figure out how to get away with it. It's just sort of like, unfortunately, obviously awful when this young man submitted an assignment whose sole purpose was to write from the hearts this deeply personal, actually something that appears in this book. It's called Chapter in My Life Assignment. And so I get this thing and I'm thinking, if this were written by one of my brilliant, high future Ivy Leaguer, it would be a great parody of a kid who would submit a chapter in my life assignment that was actually written by AI. And I took the kid out in the hallway and I'm like, this problem. And I wrote that. And really strained conversations. And I just kind of pointed out the obvious, like, there's not one human detail in there. There's not your black hoodie that you're wearing right now. There's not your mother's smile. It was, it was like everything around the human element that was a house, but not his house, because there wasn't the green candlesticks, anything. That's what I was making the point to him, like some concrete detail. he didn't need to pour his heart out and spill his deepest secrets for this thing to be so obviously not written by him. So fortunately for me, I think, and I've certainly gone more out of my way to design assignments that seem kind of immune to it, but I suppose nothing's immune to it. But it's there, and so far I haven't had anything too awful to deal with. Yeah.
I was a high school teacher at Lower Merion 100 years ago. And French. And I found now that if I wanted to write something in French, I can type an actual whole sentence into Google and I get a beautiful translation back. And I've said to former colleagues, go away on my teaching, because unless you made every assignment, post it right here under my eyesight, how can they do anything? Because it's so easy. So I'm curious how it affects their writing, but it sounds like you're focusing on assignments. So, but that has to play into it because everything is available. And I see it with our 4th grade granddaughter that she was writing, she did some assignment and I'm like, oh, that's really good. And it was sort of like, yeah, well, I found all the information on whatever site it was. And I said, then you didn't write it, you created. So how do you separate that with teenagers, not even just little ones?
Sure. Well, the very practical answer to that is, you know, again, it's like what we're talking about with the phones. It's not just like that's bad, you know, don't do that. It's, you know, what you're missing. So I try to emphasize, you know, this is the whole point of this course is this, you know, creativity and finding your own voice, etc. And the only thing I can do, and maybe there's a way around it, is that on the first day of class, every student of mine, regardless of the course, creates a Google Doc and they share it with me. And it is literally the only place where they write a single thing. And Google Docs has, you know, if you care to look, you know, a date and time of every digit that's typed into the thing, one after another. So even if somebody wrote it in a separate doc and then plopped it in there all at once and said, I did my assignment last night, I mean, I'm not checking the date and time of each thing, but if I was suspicious, and then I could look at it and like, this all appeared in this second on, you know, that's the first fishy piece of evidence. So they have to write it live in that doc. And that's one thing. Yeah. And again, you know, that's in the new rules too, because everything that is conceivable that a kid could have done that I never thought I needed a rule for last semester happened. And one student would continuously come up with this, like, well, I wrote it in a separate doc and then I put it in there. And so she was down to the wire, close to, you know, failing the course, and she had other problems. There's a lot of these things that we've been talking about. And I sympathize. I'm like, you have to do this in this doc.
You're strictly
I have an AP Modern Lit class. I teach creative writing, a couple levels of creative writing, and then like a basic lit class. Creative nonfiction. So that's kind of the creative writing. And just I wish a few of them would put a bit more stress in.
colleges being optional,
Yeah.
being open, you know, admissions being open to so many people for specific schools. I guess the competitive nature of it is increased. Do you find them suffering and what through this process?
There was a point where it was shocking to me and everybody else, and students foremost, at just how hard it was, how few kids, not just were getting into the top schools that we're going to talk about, like the really hard schools, but I'm sure it's all the same all the way down. It's all relative, right? But certainly at the top, you know, the acceptance rates are so small. By now, I think that those high flyers understand it doesn't make it any less painful when they don't get into where they want to go. It's so arbitrary. that they just kind of get the game now, that it's not about you. You know, you had a 4.3 and you got a 1,600 on your SAT and you didn't get into your top school, but you got into this other school, or, you know, they didn't get into schools you'd think, and then you know, maybe they got rejected from 8 out of the 13 schools they applied to, and they got into Brown, and everyone's just like, okay, I don't get it. So you just have to do your best and get your applications out there, you know, spread it out and be smart about it. But it doesn't make logical sense anymore in the way that you would expect. On the other hand, I suspect the logic is there's a lot of really highly qualified, incredible candidates. And, you know, these schools are selecting who they want to select, and schools are lucky in that way.
High standards, very competitive.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. I suspect it is different in this school district for the exact reason that you're described. One thing that is different in Rose Tree Media, where I teach, is that it's pretty diverse socioeconomically. And I would say going maybe 20 years ago, I saw another really dramatic shift when the prices of schools were skyrocketing, that let's say that the top 5 kids were starting to get full scholarship offers from Temple, Penn State, Pitt. These big schools were getting really smart and creating these really sort of niche worlds within their world of like the honors college, and they're really appealing. And they were snagging the valedictorians and the salutatorians and some of the top kids. So I think they've gotten wise to that too. And no matter how much money one's household might have, anybody agrees that $100,000 a year is a lot of money for the school, which is, I think, what Vanderbilt just hit. And so, you know, a lot of these kids are looking for those scholarships. Some of the brightest, the most capable kids are going to these schools. But it's hard. I think the way they're dealing with it is that they're applying to a lot of schools, and their guidance counselors are telling them so that they're prepared.
Thanks. Can I add to that? When you say they apply to a lot of schools, I've looked into this too. We have a freshman in college right now. There's a reason technology has allowed students who would have applied to 5 schools can easily apply to 15 schools now. That's the way it works on the Common App. So more applicants, and I've actually done the homework. More applicants in every school. Sure. They would apply to schools they never would have applied to, because it's not writing like the application like I did. It's just hitting a button. That's it. So now you can apply to more. Yeah. So that the rates go down because of the number of applicants that they wouldn't have taken anyway. That's the trick. You know, so it's not statistically true. None of it is. But more kids apply.
Oh, I'm sure it's
suggesting that they figured out that.
I'm sure it is. I haven't been exposed to it, and you know, as much as they might be very forthright and personal in a lot of their writings, it hasn't been something that they're writing a lot about, and it's not something that I'm seeing, you know, in person. But I'm sure he's right. I just don't have a lot of personal experience with them reading in front of me. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not. Any other questions? So I had a longer chapter that I had in mind if there weren't a lot of questions, but I'm delighted that there were. And now I'm gonna stick with my plan of wrapping it up with a short reading, and then we can be done. So the one thing that I wanted to hold off on is sort of something that would capture that other aspect of the book, and that's, you know, my life as a dad and the kids, and how that has contributed to my life as a teacher, and I think has informed, you know, the way I might interact with a student in a way that I would not have had in me prior to having kids. But first one that features me and my oldest son, and then I'll wrap another short chapter that's me and a student that sort of illustrates that point. So this is another very early chapter. It's There's one after the two that I read earlier, and then there's this one. It's called Oncologist Visit. No school today. It's snowing again. Tomorrow I'm flying to Tampa, Florida for a writers conference, or at least that's the plan. Or at least that's the plan, depending on the weather conditions. But first I have to break out the snowblower, and I still have to pack. And I have an appointment with my oncologist at Penn at 3. Before I go to Florida, I want to confirm that last month my lymph nodes were swollen because of a sinus infection, not because of a recurrence of lymphoma. I might not be able to make it into the city if the snow keeps falling like this. I emailed the nurse practitioner who tells me to come in right now since all the other patients have canceled their appointments. Her offer would be funny if she were joking. Instead, I'm wondering why she doesn't tell me to stay home like everyone else. I take a deep breath and brace myself for a treacherous ride. Christopher is home from school too. I inform him he's coming with me to the hospital. Can we go to McDonald's? He asks, in a tone that suggests this is a negotiation. Deal. After a brief examination, my doctor says, you don't have cancer, and reminds me that now, after 5 years in remission, I've got the same chances of getting it that he has. In the elevator on the way out, we see a bald little boy in a wheelchair. I smile hello to his parents. Last treatment today, they say. Congratulations, I say. In the parking garage, Christopher says, do you think I'll get cancer? I say, I hope the hell not. How do I get cancer? He asks. I say, if you figure that out, you'll be famous. He says, why don't you just look it up on Google? In the car, I call Vanna and announce, all cleared. Instantly, she's crying, and it takes me a moment to remember that I'm not alone in this ongoing flight. It's a cry she's obviously been storing up since last month's ambiguous results. She'd given no sign of her fears, which would explain this surprising expression of relief. Everything's okay, I say, happy to soothe as we drive out of the city. As we enter the McDonald's drive-thru, I'm expecting Christopher to ask me why mommy was crying. But the news on the radio has our attention, and now I'm expecting questions about the porn star suing the president. Instead, as I hand Christopher his Happy Meal, he says, I wonder what the toy is. And I'm relieved of my burden. I should end on the laughter, but I can't resist this one. So this one's called Summer Reading. How do you know when your students have learned? That's what Freddie Wetz, our principal, has been asking us recently. I'm not sure what the answer is exactly. It's easier to know when a student has not learned, like when she leaves a quiz blank or stares at you dead-eyed when you ask her a question in class. But even then, you never know what might have sunk in, even if she can't demonstrate the learning gain you only dimly suspect. 8th period Jasmine, a senior creative writing student who was absent Friday, takes her summer reading test in the hallway. She returns minutes later, teary-eyed, nose ring glistening, and asks if we can talk after class. The other students are working quietly on their rant assignment. So I sit at the empty desk next to her and say, no time to read this summer? Tears are falling now. My summer was terrible. I meant to do it. I like to read. I just couldn't. She's choking on her words. I have no doubt she's been through something rough. Okay, let's come up with a new plan, a new deadline. Her eyes widen. I say, you think about it and I'll think about it and we'll talk again tomorrow. She nods warily, as if she half thinks I'm going to throw her a curveball now with a lecture on living in the real world and digging herself out of the hole she's already in. Instead, I recap for her the instructions for today's assignment, since she was out in the hallway when I explained them earlier, and she gets right to work on her laptop. 21 years of teaching and 7 years of being a dad have gotten me to this point. It used to be that I was the cool young teacher, or at least that's what I was led to believe. But it's really now that I'm cool, or cooler than I was then, whether the kids think so or not. In the early years, I wasn't the kind of cool that took this kind of action, sitting down like this to hear a student out, to really listen, and then to propose a modified plan specific to her needs. As if I were actually running the show here. As if I actually had the freedom to take command of how this or that student might best be served by the educators charged with teaching her. Now I understand that in this classroom, this moment is mine to seize or to squander. Thank you so much, Jasmine says when I get up from the desk next to her. When I return to my lectern at the front of the room, I pretend to be grading papers, though I've got my eye on Jasmine, who's wasted no time starting her rant. That terrible summer, no doubt, igniting the imagination and firing those furious fingers. When one hand rises to wipe a damp cheek, the other drums heedlessly at the keyboard. And thank you so much. Don't forget to take a free left party. Thank you to Lower Merion Libraries and to you all for hosting me, and to Narberth Bookstore, who has come here to help with the transactions. So please pick up a copy of the new book if you like, and the more recent one on that other topic too. Thank you so much for coming.
And thank you for the lives you've changed.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And if you'd like me to sign your book, I'd be happy to. 15 or 20 minutes, I think, before we have to get out of here. Good.